In the shadowed corridors of Alexandria's ancient library, long before the flames consumed its wisdom, there existed a body of knowledge so profound that successive generations of mystics, philosophers, and seekers would spend millennia attempting to decode its implications. Among the countless texts that lined those hallowed walls, one collection of teachings stood apart, a distillation of principles so fundamental to the architecture of reality itself that they were said to have originated not from human contemplation, but from the divine intelligence of Thoth himself, the Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, and magic. These 7 principles, encoded within what would later be known as the Hermetic tradition, represented something far more consequential than abstract philosophy or religious doctrine. They constituted a precise map of consciousness, a technology of transformation disguised as metaphysical speculation. This internal technology is exactly what we've mapped out in our private laboratory records. If you feel ready to navigate these deep psychological waters, the link to our complete Magnum Opus System is in the first comment below. Now, let's explore how the thrice greatest Hermes and Carl Jung converge. The name Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, emerged from the syncretism of Egyptian and Greek mystery traditions, a fusion of Thoth with the Greek god Hermes that produced a legendary figure credited with authoring the foundational texts of Western esotericism. The Corpus Hermeticum and its companion text, the Kybalion, preserved these 7 principles as the irreducible axioms governing both cosmic and psychological reality. What the ancient world presented as laws of the universe, depth psychology would later recognize as laws of the psyche itself. For in the Hermetic worldview, there exists no meaningful distinction between inner and outer, between the microcosm of individual consciousness and the macrocosm of universal being. Carl Jung, in his exhaustive study of alchemical texts and Hermetic philosophy, understood what generations of literalist interpreters had missed. These principles were never meant to describe only external phenomena. They encoded the precise mechanics of psychological transformation, the actual operations through which consciousness evolves from fragmentation toward wholeness. The 7 principles function as both diagnostic and operative. They reveal the structure of psychological reality, while simultaneously providing the leverage points for its transformation. To comprehend them deeply is to possess a master key to the locked chambers of your own psyche. The first principle, the principle of mentalism, declares that the all is mind, the universe is mental. This is not idealism in the philosophical sense, nor is it a denial of material reality. Rather, it asserts the primacy of consciousness as the substrate within which all experience unfolds. In psychological terms, this principle recognizes that you do not encounter reality directly, but only through the mediating structures of your own mind. Every perception, every interpretation, every response emerges from and is conditioned by the particular organization of your consciousness. The world you inhabit is fundamentally a psychological construction, built from sensation and structured by the unconscious frameworks you inherited and developed. This principle carries staggering implications for the project of self-transformation. If consciousness is primary, then the transformation of consciousness necessarily transforms your entire experiential reality. The alchemists understood this when they insisted that their work began not with base metals, but with the purification of the alchemist's own perception. Jung articulated the same insight when he observed that psychological projection, the mechanism by which we cast our own unconscious contents onto the external world, means we never see things as they are, but only as we are. The principle of mentalism demands recognition that before you can change your circumstances, you must change the consciousness through which you perceive and engage those circumstances. The prison is mental, and so too is the liberation. The second principle, the principle of correspondence, states, As above, so below, as below, so above. This maxim, perhaps the most widely recognized of Hermetic teachings, describes the fractal nature of reality, the way that patterns at one level of organization mirror and reflect patterns at other levels. Psychologically, this principle reveals the fundamental unity between conscious and unconscious processes, between individual and collective psyche, between internal psychological structures and external life circumstances. What manifests in your relationships? Your career, your health is not random or arbitrary, but corresponds precisely to the underlying organization of your unconscious. Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that cannot be explained through linear causation, represents a direct application of this principle. The external world mirrors and responds to internal psychological states, not because consciousness magically creates reality, but because both are expressions of a deeper, unified field of being that the Hermetic tradition called the unus mundus, the one world. When you engage in deep psychological work, you invariably notice that external circumstances shift in ways that seem impossibly coordinated with your internal transformation. This is not supernatural, but the natural operation of correspondence. As you transform the microcosm of your psyche, the macrocosm of your life circumstances cannot help but reflect that transformation. The diagnostic power of this principle is equally profound. Your external life functions as a perfect mirror of your internal psychological organization. The patterns that repeat across your relationships, the same obstacles that recur in different forms, the chronic dissatisfaction that persists despite changing circumstances, all of these correspond to unintegrated complexes, unconscious patterns, shadow material demanding recognition. The Hermetic maxim instructs, look at your life circumstances, and you will see, reflected there, the precise structure of your unconscious. Look at your dreams, your fantasies, your spontaneous imagery, and you will find, encoded there, information about your actual life circumstances and relationships. The barrier between inner and outer is far more permeable than conventional understanding admits. The third principle, the principle of vibration, asserts that nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. In the Hermetic understanding, there are no static states. All apparently solid forms are actually patterns of movement, frequencies of vibration that create the illusion of stability. Psychologically, this principle describes the dynamic nature of consciousness itself. There is no fixed self, no permanent psychological structure. What you experience as your stable identity is actually a relatively consistent pattern of psychological vibration, a habitual frequency at which your consciousness tends to resonate. Depression, anxiety, joy, peace. These are not things you have, but frequencies at which your consciousness vibrates. The alchemical tradition spoke of raising and lowering vibrations, of transmuting base psychological states into refined ones through the application of conscious attention and will. Jung observed the same phenomenon in the natural fluctuations of psychological energy, what he called the progression and regression of libido. The principle of vibration suggests that psychological transformation is fundamentally about changing your characteristic frequency, learning to vibrate at a different rate, to resonate with different qualities of experience. This principle also illuminates the mechanism of psychological contagion. Consciousness is not isolated, but constantly resonating with and being influenced by the vibrational frequencies of other psyches, of collective moods, of archetypal patterns active in the unconscious. When you enter a room and immediately sense the emotional atmosphere, you are detecting vibration. When you spend time with someone and notice your own mood shifting to match theirs, you are experiencing vibrational resonance. The Hermetic adept learns to consciously modulate their own vibration to maintain psychological sovereignty even while immersed in fields of collective psychological pressure. This is not emotional bypassing or spiritual bypassing, but the cultivation of what Jung called a stable ego, capable of relating to unconscious contents without being overwhelmed by them. The fourth principle, the principle of polarity, declares that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. This is perhaps the principle most central to both alchemical and Jungian psychology. All psychological phenomena exist not in isolation, but as one pole of a complementary pair. Consciousness and unconsciousness, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, spirit and matter, order and chaos. These are not separate things but inseparable aspects of unified wholes, distinguished only by degree, not by kind. The alchemical tradition encoded this principle in the image of the coniunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites that represents the culmination of the great work. The Hermetic texts insisted that all opposites can be reconciled, that apparent contradictions represent different degrees along a single continuum. Psychologically, this principle reveals why one-sided development inevitably produces compensation from the opposite pole. Pursue only consciousness, and the unconscious erupts with doubled force. Identify exclusively with light and shadow grows proportionally darker. Cultivate only spirit and matter demands recognition through symptom and compulsion. Jung's entire therapeutic method rests on this principle. Neurosis arises from the repression or denial of one pole of a psychological opposition, and healing occurs through the conscious integration of what has been rejected. The transcendent function, Jung's term for the psychological capacity that allows consciousness to hold the tension of opposites without collapsing into identification with either pole, represents the practical application of Hermetic polarity. The work is not to eliminate one pole in favor of the other, but to develop the psychological capacity to contain both, to allow a third thing to emerge from their union that transcends while including both original poles. The fifth principle, the principle of rhythm, states that everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall. This principle describes the pendular nature of all phenomena, the inevitable oscillation between polarities. In psychological terms, no state of consciousness is permanent. Energy flows into consciousness and then recedes into the unconscious. Periods of expansion alternate with periods of contraction. Phases of integration follow phases of dissolution. The alchemical tradition mapped these rhythms through the repetition of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, break down and build up, over and over in cycles of increasing refinement. Understanding this principle provides essential protection against inflation during periods of psychological expansion and against despair during periods of contraction. The rhythm is impersonal, a fundamental characteristic of psychological life rather than evidence of success or failure. Jung observed that the individuation process does not proceed linearly, but spirals, returning again and again to similar themes at deeper levels. Each cycle of dissolution and reconstitution processes material from a new layer, integrating shadow contents and enlarging the personality incrementally rather than dramatically. The Hermetic texts teach that while you cannot prevent rhythm, you can learn to neutralize its destructive effects through conscious awareness. By understanding that contraction necessarily follows expansion, you prepare yourself psychologically for the inevitable regression. By recognizing that this too shall pass, you avoid identifying with temporary states as if they were permanent conditions. The art lies not in escaping rhythm, but in surfing it, using the energy of both rising and falling tides to move deeper into psychological truth. The sixth principle, the principle of cause and effect, asserts that every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. In the Hermetic framework, nothing happens by chance. What appears as luck or accident is simply causation, operating through laws not yet understood. Psychologically, this principle reveals the deterministic structure of the unconscious. Your current psychological state is the effect of causes reaching back through your personal history, your family system, your cultural conditioning, even into the deep structures of the collective unconscious Jung called archetypes. Most people live as effects, unconsciously responding to stimuli according to patterns established by causes they have never examined. The depressive response triggered by criticism, the anxious reaction to uncertainty, the compulsive behavior activated by stress. These appear to happen to you as if you were merely the passive recipient of psychological weather beyond your control. The Hermetic tradition teaches that liberation lies in becoming cause rather than remaining effect. This does not mean you can control external circumstances through will alone, but that you can consciously engage the causal mechanisms within your own psyche. Jung's analytical method represents precisely this shift from effect to cause. Through the examination of dreams, active imagination, and careful attention to unconscious manifestations, you trace effects back to their causes, the complexes, the unintegrated shadow material, the archetypal patterns demanding recognition. Once cause becomes conscious, you gain the capacity to intervene in the causal chain. The automatic reaction becomes a choice. The compulsive pattern becomes visible and therefore modifiable. You rise, as the Hermetic texts describe it, from the level where you are subject to causation to the level where you participate consciously in the causal process. The seventh principle, the principle of gender, states that gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. This is not about biological sex or social gender roles, but about the fundamental polarity of active and receptive, projective and receptive, yang and yin principles that operate at all levels of reality. Psychologically, Jung articulated this through his concepts of animus and anima, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche that must be integrated for individuation to occur. The masculine principle represents focused consciousness, discrimination, penetration, analysis, activity, form-giving power. The feminine principle represents receptive awareness, synthesis, gestation, intuition, receptivity, form-receiving capacity. Both principles exist within every psyche regardless of biological sex, and psychological health requires their balanced development and conscious integration. Problems arise from over-identification with one principle and rejection of the other, creating internal warfare between masculine and feminine aspects of the self. The alchemical marriage, the mystical wedding depicted in countless Hermetic illustrations, represents the conscious union of masculine and feminine principles within the individual psyche. This is the conjunctio, the sacred conjunction that produces the philosopher's stone, the integrated, individuated self. The work requires first the separation and purification of both principles, then their conscious reunion at a higher level of integration. This is not the unconscious fusion of undifferentiated chaos, but the conscious union of differentiated and developed opposites. When these seven principles are understood not as abstract philosophy, but as precise descriptions of psychological architecture, they reveal themselves as a complete technology of transformation. They describe how consciousness is structured, how it operates, and most crucially, how it can be consciously transformed. The Hermetic tradition did not present these principles as information to be believed, but as operations to be practiced. They are meant to be applied, tested through direct experience, verified in the laboratory of your own psyche. The psychological implications are staggering. If consciousness is primary, then transforming consciousness transforms reality. If correspondence operates, then internal work necessarily manifests externally. If everything vibrates, then you can consciously modulate your vibration. If polarity is universal, then integration of opposites is both possible and necessary. If rhythm is inevitable, then you can prepare for and navigate its cycles. If causation is lawful, then you can move from being effect to being cause. If gender is universal, then the sacred marriage within is the path to wholeness. Jung spent decades studying alchemical texts precisely because he recognized in their symbolic language a complete map of psychological transformation that paralleled his own clinical observations. The stages of the alchemical work, Nigredo, Albedo, Citrinitas, Rubedo, correspond to identifiable phases of psychological development that his patients naturally pass through. The Hermetic principles provided the theoretical foundation explaining why these transformations occurred in the sequences they did, governed by laws as precise as those operating in physical chemistry. But here, the tradition issues its characteristic warning. These principles describe operations that occur whether you engage them consciously or not. Your psyche already operates according to Hermetic laws. You already vibrate at particular frequencies, resonate with particular archetypes, oscillate between polarities according to natural rhythms. The question is not whether these processes will occur, but whether you will participate in them consciously or remain their unconscious subject. The difference between being lived by archetypal patterns and living them consciously is the difference between psychological slavery and psychological sovereignty. The work demands everything. It requires the courage to examine the causal chains that have shaped your personality, to consciously engage with shadow material you have spent a lifetime avoiding, to hold the tension of opposites that your psyche desperately wants to collapse into one-sided identification. It requires patience to honor natural rhythms rather than demanding constant expansion. It requires discernment to distinguish between regression in service of the ego and regression in service of the self. It requires humility to recognize how little of your psychological life occurs under conscious control, and how much work remains to be done. The Hermetic tradition, like depth psychology after it, insists that this work cannot be done through intellectual understanding alone. The principles must be embodied, lived, integrated through sustained practice and application. Reading about the principle of mentalism does not transform your consciousness. Understanding the principle of correspondence does not automatically manifest the synchronicities that indicate psychological integration. These principles describe potentials that must be activated through deliberate engagement with the unconscious. The classical methods remain essential. Dream work, which provides direct access to unconscious contents. Active imagination, which allows dialogue with archetypal figures. Symbol work, which engages the image-making capacity of the psyche. Body work, which addresses the somatic dimension of psychological complexes. Relationship as crucible, which constellates unconscious material that cannot be accessed in isolation. The Hermetic principles provide the theoretical framework, but the actual transformation occurs through sustained application of these methods over years of dedicated practice. What emerges from this work is not the superhuman figure of fantasy, but the integrated individual Jung termed the realized self, the personality that has consciously engaged with both light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, and learned to function as a relatively stable center capable of relating to all aspects of psychological life without being overwhelmed by any of them. This integrated consciousness naturally vibrates at a different frequency than the fragmented psyche. It naturally manifests different circumstances through the operation of correspondence. It naturally participates in causation rather than remaining merely effect. The social implications of this work extend far beyond personal transformation. Jung understood that the collective shadow, the unconscious complexes active in groups, nations, entire civilizations, could only be addressed through the individual work of conscious integration. As each person does the difficult work of psychological transformation, they necessarily contribute to the evolution of collective consciousness. The Hermetic principle of correspondence ensures that individual transformation ripples outward, affecting the larger fields of which the individual is an expression. But the tradition remains realistic about the numbers willing to undertake such work. The path of conscious psychological transformation has always been the narrow way followed by few. Most will remain content with consensus consciousness, living as effects of causes they never examine, oscillating between poles they never integrate, subjects of rhythms they never understand. This is not judgment but observation. The work is voluntary, and most will not volunteer. The comfort of psychological unconsciousness exceeds the promised reward of painful integration. For those who do undertake the journey, the Hermetic principles serve as compass and map. They describe the territory that must be traversed, the obstacles that will be encountered, the resources that can be cultivated. They promise not ease but coherence, not comfort but meaning, not certainty, but the hard-won sovereignty of consciousness that has confronted its own depths and integrated what it found there. They reveal that the ancient wisdom and the most modern depth psychology converge on identical insights about the structure and transformation of consciousness. In the end, the 7 Hermetic principles reveal what Thoth supposedly knew and Jung rediscovered through decades of clinical work: that consciousness is not fixed, but evolving, not simple, but structured according to precise laws, not isolated, but intimately connected to larger patterns of cosmic and psychological reality. The treasure these principles point toward is neither external achievement nor spiritual transcendence, but the difficult and valuable work of becoming whole, of integrating the scattered fragments of consciousness into a coherent self, capable of living deliberately rather than being lived by forces it does not understand. The wisdom is ancient, but its application remains eternally contemporary, for the architecture of the psyche has not changed since Thoth first encoded these principles in the mystery schools of Egypt. The laboratory is within, the work awaits, and the principles that govern the transformation are as precise and reliable as they were 4,000 years ago, when Hermetic philosophy first emerged from the depths of human contemplation. The transformation is no longer a mystery, it is a choice. You are the alchemist, and the laboratory is open. Click the link below to access the 6 stages of the soul and begin your own great work. Don't forget to subscribe to the Hermetic Laboratory for more deep dives into the architecture of the psyche.